Slavery was a particularly dark moment in American history, but the Civil War ended slavery and paved the way for the comparatively enlightened period we now enjoy. African Americans, of course, desired freedom intensely, but once it was granted, do you suppose their lives were suddenly easy? Reconstruction. One of the big questions for rebuilding the United States after the war was where African Americans would fit in the new order. Constitutional amendments were passed to help answer this question. But enforcing these laws was another matter. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, took away slavery. The 14th Amendment mandated that states treat men of all races equally, and the 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote. Though these were steps in the right direction, they were hard to enforce. Some formerly enslaved people were able to enjoy privileges they had previously only dreamed of. In addition to being able to legally vote, they could attend school and hold public office. From the mid 1860s through the mid 1870s, 16 African Americans sat in Congress. In 1870, the first African American was elected senator. The achievements of Hiram Rhodes' rebels would have been grand on any scale, all the more so because they happened in the post-war upheaval. First a barber, then a minister, Revels served in the war and also established schools for freedmen before taking his seat in the Senate. PBS Pinchback's career was no less stellar. In 1872, then Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, Pinchback became the first African American governor when the Louisiana legislature filed impeachment proceedings against Governor Warder. Though Pinckney only held the office for the 35 days remaining in Warder's term, he was able to pass 10 laws for the state of Louisiana in that brief period. He later helped establish Southern University, an African American college still going strong in Baton Rouge today. Okay, so this just talks about after the Civil War, once African Americans were granted rights, that it was hard to live, but there were some who did really well. Okay, so they did get to vote, they were citizens of the United States, they got to attend school, they could hold public office. So to hold public office means to be like in the government, the Senate, the governor, anyone in the legislature who can help make decisions. A few places in the South, such as New Orleans, Louisiana, briefly tried to integrate all groups of people. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was established in 1865. Its mission was to ease the transition from slavery in the South, since the collapse of the plantation system left 4 million people suddenly homeless and jobless. Perhaps the Bureau's biggest achievement was founding 3,000 schools for African Americans. Other public relief efforts sprang up here and there. Despite these efforts, however, life for African Americans was still a daily struggle to win employment, justice, and equality. The Civil War was over, but the battle had just begun for African Americans. Okay, so even though schools were established for African Americans, we talked about it earlier, they weren't the same quality of education. So African Americans were still struggling. They were struggling to find jobs. They were struggling to be looked at and treated equally by their peers or by, the white men. Deconstruction. No sooner had the window of opportunity opened than it came crashing down. In the South especially, the war had a damaging impact. Lands were ravaged, the economy was in shambles, poor whites found themselves even poorer, and now they had to compete against ex-slaves for jobs. Very quickly, resentment grew and festered. This resentment was mostly aimed at African Americans. As many whites saw it, African Americans were the cause of the war and all of its physical and socioeconomic casualties. Okay, so this is just talking about how after the war, the South had big issues. Um, the white people who were poor, they were even poorer. The economy, like the financial atmosphere for everyone was very bad. The South had lost their slaves for their jobs, so the South wasn't happy. After Lincoln's assassination in 1865, President Andrew Johnson played a key role in returning African Americans to pre-war conditions. Right on the heels of President Lincoln's reforms, he turned back the clock. Sidestepping the new amendments that had just granted many new freedoms, he gave states control over how they wanted to treat African Americans. Southern states supported Johnson's changes and worked quickly to restrict the rights granted to African Americans under Lincoln. Okay, so President Lincoln, he was trying to create equality, but when he was killed and Johnson took over, Johnson backtracked. He took away all the hard work that Lincoln had done, and he said that states could treat African Americans however they wanted. So especially the southern states, who are the ones who lost all their slaves, they jumped on that. Black codes, which severely restricted opportunities for African Americans, were passed. These laws, which varied from state to state, systematically limited African Americans' freedoms and rights. Black codes made it illegal to be unemployed, taxed those who tried to find non-farming jobs, made renting or owning land very difficult, prohibited gun ownership, and constantly reminded African Americans that they were considered inferior. Even the right to vote was denied to many. Literacy tests, which were so hard that anyone would have struggled to pass, made sure that the mostly uneducated ex-slave population would not be casting any ballots. The Alabama test had 68 questions concerning the United States legal system and government. Do you know the answer to the question, what words are required by law to be on all coins and paper currency of the U.S.? To pass this test, you had to know that and a whole lot more. Okay, so under Johnson, when he kind of went back on the Reconstruction, they're calling it deconstruction because he undid it. Black codes were passed. Okay, and black codes they were laws that actually forbid African Americans to do things. Okay, so they were different from state to state, but they basically limited African Americans' rights. So they made it illegal to be unemployed, which we know a lot of blacks were unemployed because they were not employable because they didn't have any skill set except to farm. They got taxed if they tried to do something other than farming. They made renting or owning land very difficult. They couldn't own guns. So lots of things, lots of these black codes made it very, very clear that African Americans were inferior or less of a person than the whites. It was during this time that the white supremacy terrorist groups emerged. Most notorious among them, the Ku Klux Klan founded a group of Confederate Army veterans in 1866. The Klan quickly began to use violence to spread their ideas. The group's original founders tried to break it up when its tactics became increasingly violent, but the Klan had already grown too big. Born in Tennessee, its influence spread to every state in the South. Wanting to suppress African Americans in the sphere of politics, they resorted to beatings and later to lynching. President Andrew Johnson supported white supremacy. He was the first U.S. president to be impeached by the House of Representatives in 1868. The Senate reinstated him by a single vote. Okay, so the Ku Klux Klan was formed in 1866, and they were not a nice group of people at all. They would kill and beat African Americans, okay? They used a lot of violence to get what they wanted. They believed that the white man was superior, and Andrew Johnson, who was the president at the time, believed that also, okay? He was actually the first president to ever be impeached by the House of Representatives, but he was reinstated by one vote. And by 1876, another set of laws emerged to belittle African Americans in a new way. These Jim Crow laws made segregation legal, couched in the rhetoric that African Americans should be separate but equal. This was just one more way African Americans were sent the message that they were considered different and would be treated so. Okay, so it's not all together and equal, it's separate but equal, right? So African Americans, you can go over here, and the white people can come over here, but we're equal, right? If we're equal, then we should all be together, if you ask me. It must have been difficult for newly freed people to be promised opportunities only to see them continually denied. It seemed that most whites in the South were doing everything possible to reestablish the conditions that had existed under slavery. Pressure to return to the plantations increased as the economy continued to sag. But newly freed African Americans faced countless uncertainties and could not trust their former owners to act fairly. The experience of Jordan Anderson provides a first-hand look at some of the feelings a formerly enslaved person experienced while trying to navigate free life alongside whites. Jordan Anderson had been enslaved by Colonel P. H. Anderson in Big Spring, Tennessee until 1864, when he escaped to freedom. After the Civil War ended, Anderson was living and working in Dayton, Ohio, when he received a letter from his former master. The colonel asked him to come back to work at his old home. Suppose you were in Jordan Anderson's shoes. How do you think that you would have responded to such a letter? The colonel revealed his reliance on Anderson. In fact, such a request may not have been unusual since landowners faced a shortage of workers once slavery ended. Southern landowners were desperate to get people to do all the farm work previously done by the free enslaved African Americans. Without workers, their land had little value and their wealth was threatened. All right, so this is just talking about what we've talked about a whole bunch, that the white men had no one to now work their land, and especially in the South, they wanted to return blacks to kind of like slavery. They wanted them to still come work for them, and they didn't really want to pay them. So this is where they came up with crop sharing, which we talked about last week. Most formerly enslaved people had few resources and no formal education to equip them for life in the post-war America. But they had important choices to make. One of the goals of the Freedmen's Bureau was to get formerly enslaved people working the plantations once again, but under fair conditions. Rumor of a government plan to give 40 acres and a mule to African Americans to help them get started in producing their own crops turned out to be a myth for all but a few. So it became nearly impossible for African Americans to work their way out of poverty. One arrangement for newly freed citizens was sharecropping, though this was far less desirable than owning one's own land. In exchange for a share of the harvest, sharecroppers farmed the land for the landowners. Some landowners got what they wanted out of the bargain, but African Americans rarely made out as well. In many ways, sharecropping was similar to slavery. So in sharecropping, basically, the African Americans rented a piece of land from the white people and they farmed it, and the white landowners gave them the tools and the seeds, and they housed them and they gave them food, but in return the formerly enslaved African Americans had to sell the crops and pay the white people, and a lot of times they ended up in debt. Many newly freed African Americans were drawn to the West. All sought and some found better treatment and work. Some towns even sprang up with an all African American population. Brooklyn, Illinois, founded by free and escaped African Americans in 1820, is usually credited as being the first town settled by African Americans. The town's motto, founded by chance, sustained by courage, reflects the spirit of its earliest residents and those who came to Brooklyn looking for a new life as free people. The Freedmen's Bureau helped to support the establishment of other African American towns during Reconstruction. They helped to establish 20 such towns in Oklahoma alone. This is sustained by courage. This is Jordan Anderson. This is how he replied to his former owner's letter. Anderson's letter was printed in the New York Daily Tribune on August 22, 1865. Jordan Anderson's description of his life is probably representative of what town life would have been like for many African Americans. Just like the motto of Brooklyn, Illinois says, he would have had to draw on a lot of courage. Jordan Anderson says he is doing tolerably well. He is earning $25 a month plus food and clothing and has a comfortable home for himself, his wife Mandy, and 3 children who are going to school. Then he asks his former master to tell him how much he will be paid if he returns to the colonel's service. He needs this information to decide whether it is to his advantage to move back to Tennessee. He calculates what he believes his former master owes him for his past service, and under the circumstances, it's hard not to admire Anderson for standing up for himself in this way. He proceeds, I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. This paragraph highlights many of the Southern hardships enslaved people faced.